Hi guys, welcome back to the Revive Stronger podcast. I'm your host, as always, Steve Hall, and today I have Dr. Grant Tinsley on the podcast for the first time. He has a PhD in kinesiology and exercise nutrition. He is the professor at Texas Tech University, has published work in some of the top journals. You've probably seen and read some of his work, or at least come across it. And his major interests of his personal lab are in critical evaluation of body composition assessment techniques, energy balance manipulations ranging from intermittent fasting to overfeeding, and sports nutrition strategies to improve performance and body composition. He has been training for over 20 years himself. You're going to hear a bit about his background and how he got to where he is today. And we had a fantastic discussion surrounding measuring body composition. So tracking changes in muscle mass, in fat mass, and we talk about all things from DEXA scans to what practical things can you use at home, what common mistakes do people make, what's the lowest body fat we can actually get to before we might die. Lots of great discussion, such as where is AI going to take us? Is this going to be something that we can use in future to have almost perfect tracking of some of these trends? So much fun in this podcast. I think you guys will really enjoy it. As always, guys, if you do enjoy the podcast, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes where we're always talking about these sort of subjects and things relating to muscle gain, fat loss, all things health and well-being. And of course, if you do enjoy this, share it with anyone else you think might enjoy it. Give us a 5-star review on something like Spotify, or if you're listening to Apple. I know lots of you listen to it over on there. And on YouTube, of course, give us a nice comment, a thumbs up. It's really appreciated. And if you are listening, take a little screenshot, share it on your story. If it's over on Instagram, tag myself and Grant, and then we can give you our best. And I appreciate it highly. But without further ado, let's dive into the show. So Grant, it's amazing to have you here today. You won't know, but I've done a separate intro prepping the listeners for what an awesome person you are in terms of kind of your academic background and wealth of knowledge that you bring. But I don't know personally, and the audience won't know because this is the first time that you're on the podcast, kind of what made you get interested in even pursuing that. So I'd love to first of all hear kind of what got you interested in exercise, nutrition, body composition, and what led you to eventually becoming a PhD in the field.
Yeah. So first, thanks for having me on the podcast. I've seen you online for a long time and really appreciate connecting with you. Appreciate all the good information you disseminate. So yeah, in terms of my background, I started as a skinny teenager who wanted to gain muscle. I remember the first time I really thought about nutrition and exercise affecting body composition, kind of when it was employed in a systematic way, is when I was in junior high school. So I think I was probably around 12 years old probably. And I had this friend who, for whatever reason, had this fitness program where every night he would do 100 push-ups and 100 sit-ups. And he was just kind of unusually jacked for a kid that age. And up to that point, I played sports, I was active, I did all this. But I hadn't seen someone who was like my age who was intentionally investing in their physique. And he had abs, like girls would ask him to take pictures, like him and his abs and all this stuff. And it was the first time I was like, interesting. Okay, he's investing in his physique. There's payoff for that in a number of ways. So that's really what got me interested. And I knew my dad lifted weights, but he did it at a gym on his lunch break. So I never saw it. I didn't grow up seeing it. But I remember the Christmas, I think I must have been 12. It was around that age where I got my first weight bench and dumbbell set. I think I got like a set of 10s and a set of 25. So I'm like shakily doing the 10s for curls, and I have the 25 shakily doing bench press. But that's really when I started. So I started training at home, not really knowing what I was doing. When I was 16, my parents let me join the local gym. So I had to bike, a couple miles to get there, but they let me join the gym and started lifting there. I was, watching all the people who knew what they were doing, asking the personal trainers and their questions and so on. So, and that was around the same time I started to get exposed to, supplement marketing and fitness magazines. And I wasn't a religious reader, but saw them enough just to kind of see some of these trends and have a lot of questions about, the fitness industry and how the body adapts. Concurrent with that, I've always been a super nerd. I just love school, always loved school, and particularly loved science, whether it was, physics, chemistry, biology. I loved it all. So when I went to university, I knew I wanted to study science, and I knew I was interested in the body, but I wasn't really sure where this would all take me. So I ultimately ended up studying human physiology as well as nutritional sciences. And this also brought me, I was, at a large university rec center working out. Was a lot different than my local gym. So I saw all these guys and girls who had lifted weights for sports, which I never had. I was involved in sports, but not in large enough programs where we had structured resistance training. So I saw these people who had been wrestlers and football players, and they were lifting a lot differently than I did. So I had a lot of, it kind of accelerated my own progress in the fitness realm as I'm both learning things academically and then learning a lot from, the people in my dorm and just, people I connect with at the rec center and so on. So after, those 4 years, I went on and got a master's in biomedical sciences, which was just a lot of anatomy and physiology. We did a lot of cadaver dissection, which gave me a great appreciation for how unique anatomy is. Sometimes we look at these textbook diagrams and it's like, oh, this is how all the muscles look. And then when you're cutting someone apart, you're like, wait, their muscles don't look like that. So just a really great educational experience. And from there, I was honestly still not sure what I wanted to do. I was pursuing my strength conditioning certification, and I was thinking about kind of an entrepreneurial route, but I just loved school and didn't feel like I was done there. So I found this PhD program that actually combined exercise and nutrition, which is really, what I wanted. So I went and pursued that, got involved in human research. So we're actually, bringing people in, testing them, putting them on, different exercise programs or nutrition programs, and truly fell in love with it. The whole thing, the designing the research, running the study, analyzing the data, writing, it just all fit with my nerdiness, and I just loved it. So from there, when I finished the PhD, I got my first faculty position as a professor here at Texas Tech. And I've now been out here about 8.5 years. So I run a research lab. I have some great students, and we conduct studies related to body composition, sports nutrition, and related topics. And then, I've continued lifting since I was 11 or 12. I just love it. It's, obviously great for physical and mental health. And it's a kind of fun outlet. I sit at my desk a lot here, writing and analyzing data. But I remind myself that what really got me into this was my ripped friend when I was 12, and just interested in how the body adapts and just how incredible it is.
Super cool to hear your background. Yeah, I'm always interested because for whatever reason, I find normally it's like at two ends of the spectrum. Someone's either like really skinny, so they get into weights because they're so skinny that they're like, I need to like bulk up. I don't know, for whatever reason that might be, or they're overweight. And so they kind of get into the nutrition side a bit more initially and then lose the weight and maybe get into some strength training. So you're a bit more similar to me, as in on the skinny side of the spectrum versus kind of the fatter end of the spectrum. And I was the same actually as you, Grant. I was one of my friends went to the gym and I was like, hey, where have you been? Like, oh, I went to the gym. I was like, huh, I feel left out now. I'm going to go. And I just fell in love with the process of going there and kind of, lifting up weights, and just found that really fun. So I guess you've been lifting for certainly over a decade now. How long has it been for you?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm 34. So yeah, over 2 decades now, I guess.
So we were talking off air about kind of the internet and being slaves to our phones and all of this. And obviously you said you've kind of followed me online for quite a while. And so we're the same age. So 1990s,
Nice.
right? You're 1990s.
Yeah, 1990. Baby. Yep.
Don't tell me your birthday's in May as well.
It's in August.
August. Okay.
A couple months
so
off.
I'm a little bit older. Nice. So yeah, really interesting also to hear you kind of almost know what your interest was relatively early on as well, where you're just like, hey, science is it. And then it's like, oh, exercise, nutrition, just love those elements. And interesting also to have that level of passion and interest in it, despite not being sport, like a specific sport that you were doing it for. It's just like, hey, you just enjoyed it for you personally, which is, again, it's just always interesting to hear how people get into it. And I think it does draw a certain person. Like the more people I've spoken to, like research and like the level of responsibility you get and everything, and the amount of hours and time you put into it, you have to love like training, nutrition. You have to be a bit of not only a nerd, but also like you like doing it yourself too. Otherwise you wouldn't have taken it probably to the level that you have.
Yeah, no, I agree. And it's, I consider it a privilege to be in an area where what I'm studying academically is something that, well-informed people in the health and fitness industries, such as yourself, want to talk about. That's what really excited me, because before I was involved in human research, I was involved in rodent research, and it was the exact opposite. So, I mean, I was just like pipetting tubes of clear liquids. I was dissecting rats and studying microRNAs that were like 22 nucleotides long, and just so far from the everyday experience of people that, if I tell someone about it, they're kind of like, oh yeah, that's really interesting. But now it's legitimately fun to study, whether it's a commercially available supplement or some technique to assess body composition or what have you. There are enough people who are in this evidence space that they're interested in it, you can actually see an impact of what you're doing beyond just the research sphere. So yeah, I do consider it a privilege to have this kind of interesting mix of, my interests and my hobbies and things that might make an impact and that people are interested in chatting about.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's the impact you're having is similar to why I wanted to go into personal training, was kind of getting myself to a place of like really poor health to much better health, and being like, oh wow, the human body is super interesting in that if you give it certain inputs and you do certain activities, you can like morph and change it and make it better, and kind of change it in a dramatic way. And so similarly with the work that you're doing, you're helping people kind of get that, and you're helping me kind of spread that information too by having kind of a wealth of information. I did actually want to touch on, I'm just interested in your thoughts on this, because obviously this is like a bodybuilding focused podcast because it's me. But you mentioned the cadavers and kind of seeing how, the textbook anatomy doesn't kind of match up exactly to uh, the people that you're seeing in front of you. And that makes me think of like natural bodybuilding, or bodybuilding in general. It doesn't have to be natural, but you can see that because obviously you're basically as lean as you could possibly be. You're trying to show off as much muscle as possible, but you can see it with bodybuilders, right? Where like different people's chest striates in a different way. The muscle fibers don't all align the same way. They might have gappy chests, like full chest. I'm just talking about chest, but the same for the abs. Like we're not all got perfect Matt Ogus symmetrical or Ryan Terry symmetrical abs like that we desire. So yeah, it just makes me think of that. And I guess, so is your training, do you focus on kind of aesthetics and bodybuilding, or has it been just a mix of things for you, Grant?
Yeah, so I do a mix. I guess if I had to put one term, it would definitely be closer to the bodybuilding style of training, with periods of more power building where I might do powerlifting style for a few main movements, but then bodybuilding accessories. But yeah, I mean, the origin of my interest was I want to gain muscle. I want to not be small. I want to fill out my shirt sleeves. So that definitely is where it started, and it really continues there. Certain things change a little bit as you age, but really not that much. So yeah, I'd say more on the physique end. I've never had the desire to step on the stage. I think I recognize, from walking around. Oops, sorry, I hit my microphone. Hopefully that didn't come off on there. But from walking around with like a above average physique to when you're ready to step on the stage, I think I'm connected with enough people who compete in physique sports that I recognize there's a lot more that goes into it, and that just hasn't been something I've desired or made time or space for. But I kind of maybe train like I'm in the off season most of the time, with maybe little periods of what would be like a mini prep without taking it, all the way to the end.
You do what I always term as like the good stuff of bodybuilding. You avoid the kind of, yeah, I mean, you enjoy it to an extent as a competitor. You keep doing it for a reason. Like there's so many kind of lessons and skills you develop, and like the gratitude you get for going through that. And I think it's made me a better person. But truly the off season and like not getting below like that lower limit of like your intervention point of body fat, where your body is fighting you tooth and nail to continue dieting down. Yeah, there's a lot of kind of true physical and like sacrifices within life, because
Yeah.
I always talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Like everything's been taken away from you. You're barely getting the bottom kind of one in terms of just living, in terms of kind of calories and food. So yeah, I don't blame you for not taking it to stage, but I'm always interested to hear, because when people have done it for so long, I'm always like, oh, why? Like it's for some people it's just the next step for them. But I think the same can
Yeah.
be said. People have said that to me for going enhanced, and I'm just like, I've never really considered going enhanced seriously. And they're like, isn't that just the logical next step for you now? You've been training naturally for so long. I'm like, I get everything I need from natural bodybuilding, so I guess it's the same for you. You get everything you need without needing to kind of step on stage, do all the tan and the shaving, and diet it down to unsustainable levels of body fat.
Yeah, I know. And again, I think it's interesting. There's probably a time it crossed my mind, but then with graduate school and the career and family and all of these things, it's just something that didn't end up rising to the top of the list. But certainly I love being connected to people who actually compete, and seeing that it's such a, again, as someone who's interested in the human body, seeing, like you were just describing, very unique physiological states where you're pushing past everything from what I can tell that your mind and body would naturally want to do, and just exerting your will on all these physiological processes to get to this end goal and step on the stage with your best package.
Yeah, you've got a good excuse there, Grant, with the amount of things that you've been doing. So yeah, I wouldn't try and compete whilst trying to do something as important and as large a priority of the various things you've been doing as well. That's a mistake I think some people make. But I guess it's a good segue, actually. A lot of your research, for people who are aware of you, will know this true and well. Those that don't, you've done a lot of research on body composition. And one of the things you've done is looking at different ways to assess body composition. So people, body fat obviously is one that comes to mind, or amount of lean muscle tissue, those sort of things. I'd love to know from you what you consider the most kind of practical and reliable methods for change to record changes in body fat and muscle over time.
Yeah. So if I had to pull out a general principle for most people, again, you might have the exceptions where it's like, oh, I have access to a research lab and, certain equipment, or I'm willing to pay for certain testing. But I'd say for most people, I would not rely on any one method. So this can be very simple, very cheap. But for example, in the physique realm, if you paired changes in body weight is certainly not everything, but it is something that matters to track, and that you can track accurately with a very inexpensive scale. So if you're taking, very standardized body weight measurements, if you're taking either progress pictures or at least performing some of that, like, I'm very aware. It's like, okay, whether that's the fit of the clothes, what I'm seeing in the mirror, or so on. Obviously, standardized progress pictures would probably be better, but one of those subjective assessments, and then pairing it with one other, cheap, relatively easy item, whether that's circumferences of certain body parts, could be like waist, hips, upper arm, thigh, without a pump. And then you can measure it with a pump to feel better later. But, something like that, or skin fold calipers, and just looking at raw, those raw measurements, the skin fold thicknesses, which are reflective of subcutaneous fat at certain locations. If you did something like that, that'd be what I just described would be very inexpensive, pretty easy to implement. And look at that holistically, while also thinking about your nutrition, your training, especially for, say, people truly in the competitive realm, such as yourself. There's so many things that are dialed in that as you look at all these data points, you should have a kind of cohesive picture of what's going on. I think where people go wrong is if they just look at one number. So they have an at-home body fat scale. They step on, they see that number, and they're like, okay, this is 1% higher than it used to be. And they might kind of freak out about that and be like, okay, I need to change my nutrition. I need to change my training. I need to change all these things. Whereas if they step back, they could say, okay, actually my training is going really well. My diet's going well. I feel like I'm looking better. My body weight's tracking with where I think I should be. If you step back, even if you have that kind of one strange data point, you can form a better collective picture and kind of de-emphasize any one metric. So I think there are a number of specific tools you can use, but that's kind of my general principle and example of multiple data points, interpret holistically, don't overreact to what you see as a number. And ultimately, I'd say on body composition, only do it if it's useful. I think there are probably plenty, and I'm sure I imagine you would, know some examples here, but probably plenty of high-level competitive physique athletes, for example, who don't take body composition assessments or don't feel that they are actually useful to them or necessary in helping them meet their goals.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that kind of not relying solely on one. I think actually what ends up happening is often people will rely on the scale and scale weight, and then they'll get frustrated with it. And then there maybe, don't know, see some content that says, throw the scale out. It's not useful anyways. And then they focus on, oh, how are clothes fitting? These sort of things. It's like, you kind of don't throw the baby out of the bathwater. Use scale along with other metrics of how things are going. And I kind of think about it like triangulating. So if they're all pointing in one direction, you can be very certain you're going in that direction. But if the scale isn't quite pointing in that direction, but everything else is being like, hey, you're doing a good job in regards to like circumference, waist measurements coming down, for example, I think that could be a really useful one that I use regularly with clients, especially if in situations I always think about recomposition is a real thing. We have really good research about that now. So if your scale weight isn't going down, but performance in the gym is going well, and then the waist measurements coming down, it's like, hey, you might even be offsetting some of that weight loss by gaining muscle mass during this period of time, which is, you don't want to kind of just dig into a further deficit and kind of miss that opportunity of that kind of unicorn of being able to gain muscle and lose fat at the same time. So yeah, I think that's so well said. And I really like that you emphasized kind of the easily and readily available kind of options that people have, and also standardized photos. I want to personally emphasize how important that can be, because I've had clients where they take like a selfie in the mirror and I'll be like, man, that's not going to be good enough to like standardize and have under the same conditions. And also you mentioned a pump that also can really massively impact things. What like if you do it in the morning versus evening, kind of standardize as many aspects as you can, even with like circumference waist measurement. If
Yeah.
you do that in the evening versus the morning, huge implications for how, like, if you're like a bit bloated, that can add centimeters around your waist. So I really like those tools. Have you seen anyone kind of, I guess in your lab, you have access to something like a DEXA and some more, maybe more precise, or I don't know if that's the right term, but more
Yeah.
expensive, less practical means of measuring things. Do you use that yourself personally?
Yeah, I do. So on a weekly basis, I do something fairly similar to what I described. So I'll have a weekly check-in at home with just a basic body mass scale with a flexible, tape measure, looking, predominantly at waist circumference, but also sometimes some other circumferences. I also use a phone-based 3D scanning app, which is really just supportive. The flexible tape measure can be plenty good, but the 3D scan you can do very quickly, and then you have circumferences from all different regions of the body, and it does it in a few seconds instead of me trying to measure each body part or asking family members to help me with this. But then periodically I do have access to multiple DEXA scanners and BodPod and professional bioimpedance and so on. So I do probably 3 to 4 DEXA scans a year. Again, kind of unique situation that I have it easily accessible here, but I'm doing the same things, very standardized overnight period of fast and rest. Kind of all of our best practices we'd use for research. And I do those scans. I always try to have one close to my annual blood work just for tracking various health markers and hormonal markers. I think it's helpful just to have that data point and see. It's actually been surprising. This has been educational to me, but even with a sample size of one, to see how things like my body fat percentage and some of these blood markers do seem to track pretty tightly for myself. So I do try to use a variety of those while still trying to heed my own advice of not solely buying into that body fat percentage number or that lean mass number or so on.
Do you think it's at all useful, Grant, for people just to get like a one-off DEXA scan just to kind of gain some information? Speaking personally, and I don't know if I'm biased here, but anyway, I got gifted one during contest prep in 2021. And I remember, I'm pretty certain I came out at like 15% body fat, somewhere around there. And I was like stage ready at this point. And I was just like, I already knew the data, like the margins of error that they can have. And so I was like visually pretty certain I was below 10% body fat at least.
Yeah.
And I've always just been like, hey, unless you can really standardize conditions and use it regularly as a kind of marker like you are, I'm not sure that it's worth spending a few $100 or pounds to kind of get one of these done.
Yeah. So this is funny. This is not scripted or planned. We did not talk about this beforehand, but I actually saw your post. I think it was before you reached out. It was maybe a few months ago where you mentioned that about your DEXA scan results. And I meant to message you, and I should have, asking like what scanner you were on. And if you had a copy of the report I could look at, because this is just a little glimpse into like the nuance here. We hear something DEXA scan and people are like, oh, DEXA scan's good. And DEXA scan is just, one thing. But there are multiple different manufacturers of DEXA, multiple different models within those manufacturers, and importantly, different software options. So as immediately when I saw your post, I wondered if you were using this one specific scanner or this one manufacturer of scanner that has this option that literally you can toggle this on or off, and it changes the body fat percentage by 5%. Because it's applying this correction factor. So immediately when I saw that post from you, I'm like, I bet whoever did it was using that software, and I bet they had this option turned on that does this correction that is really not necessary, and it essentially increases the body fat percentage by about 5%. So for what it's worth, it's possible that if they had checked this box differently and used a different software setting, it might have had you, down there at 10%. But to circle back to your question, I have mixed feelings. If a one-time scan might have some applications if someone was wanting to, for example, assess something that there's not really another easy way to assess, such as their bone mineral density. DEXA is very strong there. It's really not something you can estimate easily from any at-home technique. So especially, as people age, but even when they're younger, if they want a glimpse at like, where's my bone mineral density, I think it's a really good tool. If someone is really not particularly knowledgeable in their body composition, I think a single assessment can be helpful because the reports have reference data. So they might say, for someone of your sex, race, and age, you have higher body fat percentage than 75% of the population. For someone in the general population, that might really surprise them, especially because there's some people walking around who are normal weight who would never be told that they have obesity based on BMI or anything like that. but they actually have really high adiposity. They have low muscle and high body fat. So I think in some ways it can be informative to people who don't understand their body composition. Now, your situation obviously was the exact opposite of that. Someone who is highly in tune with their body composition, like you said, you were ready for stage. You knew you were hitting what you wanted to hit physique wise. All of this, at that point, it clearly you had the knowledge not to let it derail you. I'm sure, but it sounds like it wasn't particularly helpful. So I just have mixed feelings. There are times I think a single assessment can be helpful, but like you said, if you have more consistent access, then it would be a really good tool for tracking changes over time. So even if you're like, okay, it said 15% and that's really not accurate, they still are precise enough that you can get good kind of directionality of changes over time.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, I think that's really well explained. I would imagine the majority of the listeners are probably in a position that I am in, and it's probably similar to actually where we would be too, where you definitely don't need it, but it can be, you've got easy access to it, of course, and you have a better way of using it. But they might know of people in a situation that you described where they kind of need that kick up the arse to like, is sometimes, I don't know, blood work, for example, could be that same thing where you're not aware of what's happening in you, and you might be dealing with some symptoms that you just think are your new normal, but the blood work is just like a bit of like a, hey, you need to work on this. Similar to, like you just said, if you get that score back, you're like really harming your health by being in this body composition, like, and here are some practical things that you can do to improve it. You mentioned, I think it's kind of a reliability thing, it's reliable enough to track trends over time. That's something that some people will use, like body fat impedance. I believe a lot of scales use this. I think mine even does actually track like my body fat percentage. I don't personally like look at it. I use other means, but is it something that, obviously there's margins of error with it, but is it reliable enough to track trends over time, or is that not even something you can do with those?
Yeah, so I'll apologize in advance because I can't give a yes or no answer to this. Bioimpedance, more than any other body composition technology I know, is incredibly variable. So we have everything from $20 scales you can get just at a local store, Amazon, up to devices that are $20,000 or $30,000. So it's a very, very broad category. The professional grade devices are getting very good. They're not perfect, and no technique is, including DEXA. But say we're just talking about that home one, say a couple $100 or less. Even there's tremendous variability. And our lab has done some research in this area. We ran a study where we had like 15 different body fat scales. And almost all of these were these consumer grade scales, most of them less than $100 someone could get and use at home. And even for devices that looked identical in terms of the hardware, we saw very different results. So there were some that were decent enough, not that, again, I wouldn't use this as a single metric, but decent enough that they could be part of your complement of devices. And there were some that were so bad that it was essentially not even a random number generator, probably worse than a random number generator. And we also, we not only looked at kind of reliability at one point in time, but we actually tracked changes to get to your point here. And there were some, again, not perfect, but that did track the directionality pretty well and the magnitude decently well. So unfortunately, it's really, to me, it's a technology category where you have to evaluate on a case-by-case basis. So we've done some work in this area. I think it is the largest study that has, looked at these consumer devices, and I hope we'll do an update of it. It was a couple years ago, so lots of the scales are on the market still, but some aren't. So I'd like to do a refresh of the study. But besides having kind of like research data like that, it's a little hard to say just by looking at the scale. With that said, I will say the better performing devices typically were from the manufacturers that have been around for a long time, like Tanita and Omron. Those, I think they really, it's not that the hardware was different necessarily, but they have better kind of data, better history in the organization to refine these algorithms. Nowadays, you can find all kinds of cheap body fat scales, and it's like the parts are easy. You can throw an equation in it. Who knows where it came from? And I think some of those were the ones that performed particularly terribly, is they essentially just, the people putting them together on the software side just really didn't know what they were doing, for lack of a nicer way to say that.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, and it's nice to know that there are some available that could be of use. And again, it comes back to your first kind of point where it's like, don't use one single metric. You might use several, and then you'll probably see if it's becoming useful or not as a data point, and maybe don't just use it if it's like, hey, you're losing body weight and your body fat's going up, yet every indication is that you're not losing any kind of lean mass here. You're kind of weight training, you're hitting your protein, you're maintaining performance in the gym, maybe even building it, that sort of thing. So, and visually things are looking good. Yeah, don't lose your mind with that. But it's nice
Yeah,
to know that
absolutely.
there are some good potentially scales out there. I'd be interested to hear your opinion on this, Grant, though. In terms of body fat, do you think people within like the physique realm have an overemphasis on like knowing their body fat? How useful of a metric do you think that really is?
I think it's definitely not an essential metric. I do think it's probably overemphasized. When you said that, it always makes me think of, those charts you see where it's like a bunch of guys, like columns and rows of guys. It's like, this is 3%, this is 5%, this is 7%, and it's all different people. It's completely arbitrary. If you look, so another benefit of something like a DEXA scan, you can look at regional body fat percentage. You can see someone's body fat percentage in their trunk versus arms versus legs. And people have different distributions of body fat. At a given body fat, some people will look more lean, they'll look more defined than other people. So I was kind of laugh where it's like, there are all these factors that are different, but we're just kind of pulling out arbitrarily. I'm sure without any data to support it, just be like, oh, this is what I think 20% body fat looks like and 15% and so on. And not to say, people could use those guides. I'm not, throwing shade at anyone who's produced those guides, but it's just kind of funny because there's a lot more complexity that goes into that. And you may find that you've reached that target body fat percentage. Like I want to be sub 10, I want to be sub 10. And you get some device to tell you that you're sub 10% body fat. That may or may not reflect what you've seen portrayed as 10% body fat or what you envisioned as, what you would look like at sub 10% body fat. So all that to say, yeah, I think there's an overemphasis. I think there probably is some, hey, look at me. Here's my DEXA scan showing I'm 7.5%. Some of that out there where really you can trick it. So, I mean, well, I don't know if I should give the details how you could trick it, but you totally could if you wanted to. There are all kinds of artificial ways you could drop that DEXA body fat lower. And certainly I'm sure people will do that, whether if they're showing changes in a program, if they're aware of this, or if they're just chasing that eye-popping number to show everyone, yeah, like, hey, look, followers, I am, 7% body fat because I chugged a ton of water and jumped onto DEXA and it looks like I have more lean mass than I actually do.
Yeah, certainly it won't do your ego any good if you go in to get a DEXA and you're doing like, I don't know, you've been dieting and you're like sub 10% body fat and you haven't had a proper carbohydrate in a week. Like
Yes.
you're not going to, your lean mass is going to be looking pretty poor at that point.
Yes.
I agree with you as well in terms of actually, and I've never really thought about it in terms of those images where, yeah, like you said, there could be a black guy, a white guy, like different, like they're just showing their torso. There's so many variables that are just different between them. Is like, how useful is that? Because you're not necessarily going to look exactly like this person. They might have really thick abs, for example, or they might not hold much fat there versus you. And suddenly it's like, oh no, I'm 20% body fat. It's like, but your legs are like, you've got separation between your quads,
Yeah.
whereas their legs are soft. And I think I'm quite lucky. I hold body fat relatively evenly across my body. So it's kind of like not so bad, or a little bit more on my back and kind of glutes and that area. And it's like aesthetically, like off-season wise, it's a nice place to be, but sometimes it can give you a bit of a false perception of how lean you are. It's like, oh no, like you actually have to diet quite a lot more to get those areas in. So yeah, like you said, you could get the scale to say you're 10% body fat and that was your goal, but look in the mirror and be like, I can't see my abs yet. So, well, is the goal to see your abs, or is it a visual thing, or is it a number on the scale? Similarly, the judges couldn't care less what your DEXA scan said.
Right. That's what I was going to say is that, if it was only the body fat percentage, you would just, show up to the competition, they would DEXA scan everyone, and whoever has whatever, the best proportion of, body fat and lean mass would win. But obviously there's the art component and the aesthetics and all of that you're describing.
Talking of getting super shredded and lean, is there a physiological limit to how lean you can get? What's the lowest you've seen, and what is there a physiological kind of barrier to like, hey, body fat at some point is absolutely essential, you're going to die if you get under this?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. So for the lowest we've seen, it depends on the device. So I will say we've done a couple studies. We're doing one right now. That's a dissertation project of Christian Rodriguez, one of my PhD students, where we're specifically, like, we're doing DEXA scans as part of the screening, and we're only recruiting people who are essentially lean enough and we'll say muscular enough. We're looking at their fat-free mass index for the screening. But we want this combination of like pretty muscular and pretty lean. And those individuals, especially as they have like large limbs, can really throw off a lot of our devices. So we've had some, in fact, I won't mention here, but there was a natural bodybuilder who's also in kind of the research space that I was working with, and he was pulling in prep, like a negative body fat percentage on one of these bioimpedance techniques. And we troubleshot a few things, but then it's still like 1.5% or something that isn't real. So some of these techniques, they're typically validated in the general population. There aren't a lot of like physique athletes represented in the data those devices have seen as they develop the equation. So point being, we've seen as low as 1.5%, which is not real. On something like a DEXA, the lowest we've seen is probably between 5 and 7%. And again, not common, and there is some error involved in that. So I'm not 100% sure if that was a true value. We don't see a ton of sub 10% values, and we have a different scanner than the one I'm guessing maybe that you used. But all that to say, physiologically, yeah, I think there is a limit where you'll have problems. Now, if you would die specifically from not having body fat, I'm not sure, but there are there's data from like the Minnesota starvation experiment and some of these experiments where people might be voluntarily like abstaining from food, either back in the day kind of for medical reasons or as like a form of protest, but where they've monitored people through deep into like incredibly severe deprivation. And from some of that work, you'll see numbers floating around about minimum body fat, and it might be as low as like 3%, 3 to 5% in males, and maybe more like 10 or 12% in females. But I don't know if we can say for sure. It's like, okay, you get to a point where you're so lean, you just die. There's a lot going on physiologically as you're that deprived. Now, a healthy body can adapt to that, and it's kind of amazing. Some of these long-term starvation experiments where it's certainly not optimal. I'm not recommend, no one would do this as their bodybuilding prep. Be like, okay, I'm 2 months out. I'm just not going to eat between now and showtime. You would not step on the stage if you're able to still step on the stage with your best physique or anything. So all that to say, this is a long rambling way of saying I think it's a little hard to parse out. But yes, I think there certainly would be a limit. Even if someone literally did not eat, they had zero caloric intake, they're still expending some energy just to be alive. There'd be a point at which they are not getting any leaner. And that they would be disproportionately catabolizing, other tissues. And I guess at some point would actually die.
Very interesting. Yeah, it's something that I've seen spoken about as like a theoretical 3 to 5% is like, you can't get below that. Like I don't know why people just say that's the amount that you can't get below. As like a male, obviously you mentioned females, it's bumped up a bit higher because their essential body fat stores are a little bit higher. But yeah, I've never really heard anyone say, actually, we say that, but is it completely true? And like you said, you might be able to get leaner, but everyone knows that as a competitor, there's a point of which where if you keep dieting down, the body wants to maintain a certain level of body fat, it will just start eating some muscle tissue, and your performance in the gym will start plummeting, your sleep will be rubbish, like all of this will start kicking in. The body is very good at adapting and like preventing it kind of death essentially.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I think studying female physiology in this area is particularly insightful because there are indicators that your energy availability, so like the energy you have available to your body after taking care of things like exercise, energy expenditure, and so on, signs that that's getting too low, specifically like the loss of menstrual function. And that will happen at different levels of leanness. Some women can get very, very lean before they're having any menstrual disturbances. Others start having it at a body fat percentage that is still lean relative to them, but not like extremely lean. So to me, that's a fascinating part of physiology. Is just like you're describing, this is a situation where physiologically your body's saying, okay, we're sacrificing reproductive function because we can tell there is not enough energy available. We're able to sacrifice that. We need to be able to still function cognitively and move around and whatnot. They're very essential. So I think that's something fascinating about female physiology is you have that indicator of menstrual function and dysfunction that is kind of showing you where you might be crossing a threshold that's problematic in terms of your overall health and physiology.
Yeah, so well said. I think it's something I've experienced with taking females to stage where I'm sometimes surprised how some are able to hold the menstrual cycle throughout an entire prep. I've had bikini competitors do that. Obviously, I've done it in a strategic, well thought out, kind of periodized way in terms of not crash dieting them or anything. But that can only go so far. Whereas I've had others who will lose it much, much sooner. And it's like you said, I don't know if it's a genetic difference or what have you, but it's something that is something to pay attention to for sure. And it's a good biofeedback tool that's like, hey, something's a bit off here, not just a bit off, like quite considerably off, I should say that, quite considerably off. You want to recover that. Grant, is there any, I think you've already touched on it, but I don't know if you have any to add, but when it comes to tracking body composition, are there any kind of mistakes that immediately come to mind that people make when trying to kind of use that to assess progress?
Yeah, so a few. One that we've touched on, so I'll just briefly mention, is essentially just overemphasizing the results and not considering, all these other factors. Another that really spans across technologies, even though some technologies are more susceptible to this, but is a lack of standardization. So there's some, bioimpedance. If you're using an at-home bioimpedance scale, these types of scales are particularly susceptible to one, anything that would change your body weight. So, voiding versus not voiding your bladder, even ingesting fluid or not. We've even done studies on this in our lab where people come in after an overnight fast and period of resting. We've standardized everything. And then we only manipulate if they've had water to drink or not. And that pretty substantially changes the results. So the sensitivity for body composition technique is kind of a double-edged sword. You want a sensitive technique that can detect true changes, but that often means it's also sensitive to detect any lack of standardization. So, I mean, if you exercised, recently, even not immediately before, but recently, and you have still, say, differential pattern of blood flow, that could affect something like bioimpedance. Some like DEXA are less susceptible, but still somewhat susceptible. You mentioned this example earlier. If you were assessing waist circumference later in the day, you likely have some abdominal distension just from gastrointestinal content. That could vary based on what you eat. That's true even after an overnight fast. So, I mean, it takes more than an overnight fast for all food to be like fully through the intestines and either absorbed or, excreted out the other end. So really all of these factors, that the best practical recommendation I could give here is that after an overnight fast from food and fluid, after at least an overnight period of exercise abstention, that would be a better time to assess. And really as far as you can get from exercise. So if you have a rest day, then doing your assessment the morning after a rest day, where you've now had maybe a whole calendar day and a couple nights where you didn't exercise, that could potentially be helpful. Another way you can get around this, because even if you follow these best practices to standardize, there's still some error. Another thing you can do is potentially assess multiple times and then average the values. So for example, if you were going to assess, on a Saturday morning, your body weight, your waist circumference, all these things, you could assess there after an overnight fast, best practices and so on, then go about your normal day. Next morning, do the same thing, best practices, assess again, and just average those values. So that they should be relatively similar, but there's a little bit of noise in each of them that might be reduced by averaging those body mass values, averaging those waist circumference values, and so on. And of course, you're not interpreting it that I've changed from Saturday to Sunday. It's just saying, okay, for my weekend check-in, I'm viewing my actual value as the average of these two, just to get those 2 data points, hopefully reduce the noise a little bit. And then the next week or a few weeks later, you can do the same thing, and that might just help minimize a little bit of noise at each measurement. So yeah, I'd say those are the main things: either overemphasis, the quality of the assessment based on your standardization, ideally some knowledge of the techniques. And it doesn't have to be complicated. You could stick to nothing that's giving you body fat percentage. You could just do body mass, waist circumference, progress pictures, and that'd be perfectly reasonable. All these things would still apply. Try to get your standardized picture, standardized body weight, standardized circumference, and then just do that consistently over time.
Yeah, really well said. The only thing I have that comes to mind that I would add is I think sometimes people will try and use a measurement tool that maybe the error rate is larger than the degree of change that they can possibly even measure. So I don't know, a bodybuilder at the end of prep, they're trying to kind of, or even using the scale at that point, it's like the amount of body fat, the amount of body fat that you're looking to lose is less than the amount of variance in just water weight that could be going on. So maybe photos become a bit more reliable at that point. They're also more useful in terms of that's what matters on stage, right? Not how much you weigh necessarily. But yeah, that's something I'll see people do is like they expect, I don't know, their bicep circumference to change in a week. It's like the human error involved in you kind of measuring that might be greater than the change that we could possibly hope to see in your bicep.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. And even without having a specific like percent error in mind, that principle you just described is essential to remember. So, the smaller the change, the more skeptical you should be. The closer you are to some type of plateau, the more skeptical you should be of any kind of like large or even just moderate size fluctuations. So yeah, I think that's absolutely true. Totally different scenario if you had someone, say like a weight loss client losing substantial amounts of weight who's transitioning to exercise and structured nutrition for the first time. It buys you a lot of grace when you're having these larger changes going on. But again, yeah, physique athlete later in prep is about as opposite as it gets. I mean, just like tiny, tiny changes that, yeah, even in the lab, if I had you in the lab deep in your prep, I wouldn't be confident necessarily from week to week, maybe even month to month, that we could truly detect all of these metrics with precision enough to say like, yeah, truly you have lower body fat percentage. But you're likely seeing things in the mirror and from your experience that would indicate to you that yes, I am making progress. It might be slow progress by this point, but I'm making the progress I need to be lean enough to step on stage.
Yeah, I guess this is something. I mean, anyone who's been training seriously for a decade plus. So for you, Grant, for me, with like 20 years in the gym, almost or more than that, like it's real tough to see changes in body, like mass, lean body mass, and be able to like track those over time. And there is just, for me at least, a huge just trust in the process almost. And like in my off season, the thing I'm gaining most is body fat, of course, and seeing that go up and like trusting the surplus is aiding some sort of muscle growth. Sometimes it's not until I get down into like pretty much stage condition and then I can compare versus last time I was there and be like, yeah, you look a bit leaner at a higher body weight, or like, yeah, your delts look a bit more capped there. So there's a lot of just, I have to fall in love with bodybuilding and hope, pray and hope that, yeah, if I'm doing taking all the right steps, that something is changing there.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
There's you mentioned 3D body scanning, Grant, and I don't know if that's the same, but obviously AI is growing exponentially, and I don't know if it has, or if you're looking into it at all, and how it can be used to help our assessment of body composition. And I don't know if the 3D body scan is using AI at all. I'd love to hear about that.
Yeah, so some of them are using AI, and even before the recent surge in popularity in AI, we were working with some companies doing some, different machine learning techniques that could fall under that umbrella a number of years ago. But yeah, 3D scanning, for anyone who's not familiar, there are a few ways to implement this, ranging from your smartphone to these laboratory scanners we have. With your smartphone, a scan might be as simple as just taking kind of a frontal and a lateral image of your body. And from those two standardized images, because you're in a certain position, it kind of knits those together and produces a 3D avatar of your body. Now, this is only external characteristics. So you're in, minimal form-fitting clothing, like just, tight compression shorts or something like that, or compression shorts and a sports bra. If I were to scan myself in my normal clothes, it would see every fold of the clothing. It would see whatever's on the surface. So this is not like DEXA where we're actually, the imaging is penetrating the body. This is just surface characteristics. But you would have this 3D avatar, and then any measurement can be pulled from there. The volume of a limb, any circumference you can conceive of can be pulled from there. So that's where some of these AI applications have been used, is saying, okay, we have this avatar of the body. If we pair that with a laboratory assessment like DEXA, what variables about the body shape and size best predict what we're seeing from the DEXA scan, if we're setting that as kind of our reference or our gold standard method. So there are a number of apps that are doing that now. One company that I've done some work with has kind of advanced the smartphone scanning by actually having participants rotate in place in front of the camera, and it takes over 100 images instead of just the 2 images. So because of that, it can produce a little bit more of an accurate 3D avatar. And that's also similar to what we have in the lab. We have techniques that you'll stand on a platform and it rotates you around, and these sensors are essentially capturing infrared and visible light off your body. Or you're standing in place and there's sensors all around you. But one way or another, we're getting looks at all the different perspectives of the body in 360 degrees, and then producing this avatar. In fact, does this podcast have video or only audio?
Video as well.
Okay, then let me reach up here. So here's
it.
like a 3D printed avatar, for example. This is from one of our 3D scanners. Someone gave this to me as a present, but you just rotate around and then they have this 3-dimensional object file, and you can print someone out like an action figure.
Yeah, Grant, we were just looking at your green action figure that was produced from the 3D printer, which is actually really cool. I'm already thinking you could sell these as like, I would love a little Christmas present of a little action man figure of myself. That'd be amazing. I don't even know if that's a thing. So yeah, with AI coming into playing a role, do you think that it could be kind of take over if we call, I don't know if you would say DEXA is our most accurate measurement for measuring kind of body mass, muscle mass, and also fat mass at the moment. Could it be more accurate than that, do you think?
You know, it's possible. I would never say never, but I think it would be limited by the accuracy and detail of the inputs. So for the 3D scanning, for example, you can derive a lot of unique characteristics about body shape, and there's research on this. There are features of body shape that might be relevant to some health marker or body composition marker that might not be easily discernible with our eyes, which is kind of amazing. But at the same time, if you're talking about 3D scanning, as mentioned, you're not looking truly at anything internal to the body. So you're looking at exterior body shape, but not getting any estimate of what's going on the inside. So I think it's a great technology. I think there will be possibly a ceiling at some point where we might not be able to get to the point where we could say, for every individual, this is as good as a DEXA scan. There are some algorithms that are getting to the point where, like, okay, at the group average, this might be viewed as equivalent to a DEXA scan. Now, if that translates to every single individual, no, it probably won't. But if we can get to the point where for most individuals, we can get that level of accuracy from something that's so much more accessible, like a at-home device or smartphone-based device, that would be a really nice advance in this area where people might not have to have access to a research lab to be able to get some really high quality data.
Yeah, that's really cool. It makes me, I don't know why my mind immediately goes here. It's the bodybuilder, and now I've judged shows as well. I immediately think you could teach an AI how to judge and what to look for. It could probably do a better job than like the judge who has some subjectivity there, make it a bit more objective, using a similar sort of setup to what you're mentioning there.
Yeah, that would be a fascinating application.
Grant, thank you so much for your time. I have a bunch of questions to talk about intermittent fasting and overfeeding, which is some of your research too, which I find really interesting. So if you do me the honor, I'd love to have you back on to talk about some of those things. But I think you've done a great job of kind of diving into body composition measurement and giving some really practical take homes for people who are looking to kind of measure that and track it over time and get some valuable inputs, as well as if they're thinking about a DEXA scan or one of these less kind of easy accessible tools to measure things. If people want to keep up to date with you, your work, read more about you, where should they be heading?
Yeah, so I'll share, work from our lab, research, things I'm involved in, primarily on Instagram. So my handle there is Grant_Tinsley_PhD. And then I have a website that has some additional information about our work, links to our research and so on. And that's just my name, granttinsley.com.
Amazing. Yeah, I'll make sure that's all linked to the description. Thank you again, Grant, and thank you guys for listening. We'll catch you next time.